Welcome to Life's Third Act, an enlightening look at estate planning, retirement, and beyond.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. In this episode, and probably the next couple of episodes, we'll see, we want to talk about how trusts work. And the way that we came to the conclusion that this is a wonderful opportunity to discuss these concepts is that we've seen in the news, perhaps you've seen in the news, some of the things relating to Michael Jackson's trust, which, yes, after 15 or so years since his death, there still are issues, there still are complications, it's still in court, some aspects at least. So we see this as an opportunity to teach you, to show you examples of ways in which when you do your trust, you can better plan. Many things Michael Jackson did correctly, wonderfully, in fact, and then a few things that could be better. But for the most part, we see this as a sort of canvas on which we can talk about whenever you're planning your trust that may exist over time, so a substantial amount of time perhaps, that you can kind of think about, gee, this is the way I'll prevent that from happening. So really, as we read more and more about Michael Jackson and the issues in this estate and specifically the trust, we just thought, let's use this as a sort of teachable opportunity. So joining me today is one of our senior litigators from Houston. And she's actually practicing in both estate planning and domestic relations, Mellany McDonald. And Mellany, though, it's kind of unusual. Cordell and Cordell, for the most part, we try to have our attorneys focus exclusively on either domestic relations, if that's what they're doing, or are they on estate planning or estate probate litigation. So we think there's generally an advantage to focusing like that. So across the firm, that's the way we try to structure our practitioners in different practice areas. However, we have some, especially in our growing estate planning practice, which was just initiated a few years ago at Cordell and Cordell. We're finding that some of the attorneys who are marvelous litigators, they're kind of wanting to do some of the estate planning, including, of course, probate litigation, which is more naturally down the alley of litigation, but they're finding that this is an area they already knew about. Some of them had practiced it at some time in the past. Some of them have always had an interest in it. So we do have some lawyers who are doing both, and it in fact serves them well in their ability to effectively serve clients in each of those practice areas. So Mellany is one of those. And so Mellany, thank you for agreeing to do this show with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. We're doing this, as you can tell, she and I are not in the same room. Cordell and Cordell spread across the continent. So often when we do things together, we have to use technology, which thankfully we have technology. We wouldn't have been able to do it this way not so long ago. So let me kind of set things up, and Mellany, just jump in here as you see fit. What we want to do is we want to lay out the scenario of if you create a trust, you probably want it to go on for a long time. We're big advocates of not simply using a trust as a vehicle that empties itself, within days perhaps of your death. Instead, a trust is this marvelous opportunity to plan over decades. And now that we have dynasty trusts, easily decades. So now you can do something for your family that will endure over time and can be wonderfully beneficial in a lot of ways. Those of you who watched this show before, you know that there are huge tax benefits. There's protections regarding asset protection from a divorce, from lawsuits, all those things that can go sideways in your life, or more importantly, in your children and grandchildren's lives. Those things can be kind of walled off, or you can build a fortress essentially around the assets to assure that they're not threatened by things that go wrong in your descendants' lives, however many generations you choose to reach. So in this case, we want to show you how a trust works, where there's a number of moving parts, there's things that go on, and as was worded someone, I didn't prepare this, but one of us putting it together, and this may have been you, Mellany, chose to characterize it as it's less a lockbox than it is an operating enterprise. And that really does capture the difference that some people do not appreciate. They think that when they put money in a trust, that it's simply like putting it in a bank account where you leave it alone. Maybe it draws interest, but other than that, you leave it alone, and then when you need it, you take it out. But trusts are far more versatile than that. You can do far more things with it, wonderful things with it, and most people, or a lot of people at least, choose to do that. Michael Jackson is an example. He had a number of assets, operating businesses. He had fixed assets. He had real estate that some of it was commercial. We had Neverland and some other things, which we'll talk about in a second. So he had a variety of different assets. And this is a wonderful way to talk about how trusts work over time, is they're not simply a place to turn all your assets into liquid form immediately, which can be incredibly damaging to the value of the total estate. So it doesn't mean that you're simply creating cash and sticking it somewhere for a while. It's far more than that, which again elevates the importance of the trustee. Any comments, Mellany, at this point?
Of course. One of the things that I like to think about when I'm putting a trust together is it's more of a repository, and the assets that are going into that particular repository, we're going to determine how best they're going to suit and meet the needs of the person who is making that deposit of those assets. So depending on what your ultimate goal is, we're looking at the trust as a vehicle to move from having that static asset to becoming something more like a growth asset that can survive over that dynastic goal that you have, or the legacy goal that you have in creating the trust in the first place.
Yeah, and it's so personal. Meaning, some people want different goals, and they have different ideas about the level of growth or whether they want to retain certain assets. And I want to be careful that I don't get ahead of us. So let me set this up with some quick facts. So we set the stage for our discussion today. Michael Jackson, he died in June of 2009. We're not going to spend time talking about his life because we know others have done a far better job than we could do. And furthermore, we know that you probably know a lot about Michael Jackson's life. So we're not touching that in this show. But we want to talk about focus on the things that I just described. To do that, we want to set up a few facts. And so he died in 2009. He is age 50. I didn't know this. It was acute propofol intoxication. Was that a drug used in surgery?
Yes, a surgical drug. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of controversy about whether or not that particular drug was appropriately used by the doctor that prescribed it, but it is a prescription-based drug that's used in surgery.
Yeah, boy, I know that doctor was under a lot of heat over that. I don't know was he criminally convicted, or do you know?
I don't know. I believe that there was a lot of controversy on whether or not he was criminally responsible for it, but I don't know what the outcome of that situation was.
Yeah,
he was actually.
He was? Really? Convicted?
Yep. 2011. He was guilty of involuntary manslaughter.
Yeah. Well, when you're a personal physician for somebody like that, it's a lot of responsibility. So, all right, moving along. So Michael Jackson had a will and he had a revocable trust. He chose 2 executors, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. And he had 3 beneficiaries plus his mother. So his 3 children, Paris, Prince, and Bigi. Interesting names. I really
formerly known as Blanket.
Oh, really? I know.
Yes, that's the child that was named Blanket.
Blanket. So those 3 children, which are now adults, they'd have to be, and mother, Catherine, his mother, I think, is like 95 years old. So anyway, the division of assets is pretty straightforward. Again, his mother is Catherine. The division of assets, 40% to Catherine and 40% shared among his 3 children. So we assume that's 40% divided in equal shares, and 20% contingent on different charities. So he wanted 20% to go to charities. This is, my dog joined me, my very loyal Belgian Malinois here, who I'm not going to permit to steal the show. But anyway, this is sort of distribution that you would expect. 40%, he really wants to take care of mom. Now, mom, at 95, this interest will be passing. Perhaps there's a provision that what is not paid out will be incorporated into the trust generally and distributed to the remaining beneficiaries. That's possible. But I'll talk more about why I think that arrangement may not be what's in place now, but we'll see. On the assets, here's what's very interesting for you to know, is at the time of Michael Jackson's death, believe it or not, he was arguably in negative asset condition, meaning that he had gone in just a few years before his death in 2009, he had gone from like $331 million approximately in assets. Now, this is a number from the early 2000s, so it's at least double that today in purchasing power, to $500 million in debt at the time of his death, which again is 2009. $500 million in debt. And I think that this number is supposed to be, this was reported by AP, incidentally, is our source for that information. And I'm wondering, and I'm convinced that this means a net 500 billion negative or million negative. So net means even after considering his other assets, it's not just that he had 500 million in debt, it's a net. Didn't that surprise you?
I'm not sure I'm surprised by that. I think that with a lot of the different things that Michael Jackson was involved in, it's very easy to have a situation where the debt exceeded the actual assets. If you look at, Neverland Ranch and some of the different projects that he operated, the mansion itself, the upkeep and maintenance of those types of things, it's very easy to see where the debt exceeded the value of the assets. I think what's surprising is what the conversation will become about shortly is how that turned around, because, him spending money, I don't think that anyone was surprised by that, or at least incurring the debt. But I definitely believe that the turnaround is where the big story is.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right about that.
I will never forget this video I saw on YouTube of him going into this fancy building just full of antiques. And he's like, I'll take that. I'll take that. I'll take that. Like literally almost bought half the store, and it just exemplified his purchasing.
Often very creative people like that are not big on the subject of money management. It's not their nature.
We've seen that time and time again in this show.
Yeah. And so maybe that's what makes the estates of the wealthy, particularly in the arts, especially interesting. So, as you mentioned, he still had Neverland with him. And another source, I think, of some of his debt around the time of his death was apparently he was helping fund his upcoming tour. I think it was called This Is It, or a similar title. So he was about to launch that tour, and that was, some people were saying that the amount of that investment, which was huge at the time, may not have yielded a return. We don't know because he didn't get to do it. He died before it started. But still, that was another source, I'm sure, of much of the debt. And that
if you think about how elaborate, though, a lot of what his showcases looked like when he presented himself, and how, sometimes the shows that he put on were fantastical. And it's like when you see all of the things that all the creative components that go into that, there's no way that was a small bill, right? That had to be something that costed a pretty penny in terms of just the technical aspects, the pyrotechnics, all of the folks that it takes to put on that type of production. And so I can see where, him being debt heavy, especially when he has a pet project, I can see where that could escalate very quickly.
Yeah. And I think of Taylor Swift, she had to have taken notes from she had to have gone back and watched some of the things that Michael Jackson did. You're right. He really set the mark in the industry for elaborate productions. And Taylor Swift is really just building on what, he had conceived. So we do have this situation where, oddly enough, at the time of his death, maybe one could have argued that the total net estate was a little more. But even if you grant that it's a break even, although, again, this was the official position of those managing his account, was that it was a negative like $500 million. But anyway, even if you say, well, okay, we think that maybe it's worth a little more, still, you're talking about a guy who's a legend, and being at effectively less than zero, we can agree, at that point is just shocking to me still. But as you point out, there are things that would make this very predictable. So here's what is strange is we don't control when we die. We don't plan our deaths to minimize our estate taxes. But in this case, I have to tell you, the timing was incredible because he dies at a point when this is the value of his estate. Now, we want to also move on and talk. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the assets were before we talk about the trustees. So you mentioned Neverland. So there's some real estate of various sorts, and Neverland has gotten the most attention. And that's really an example where the value that what was spent on it never recovered anywhere near what was spent on that property. It was just kind of a bizarre, very unique place for which there was no real use, and it sold for relatively little, I think $2.2 million down the road, like a decade later, or could have been less than a decade. But anyway, so keep in mind, though, the assets we're talking about. There's music publishing rights. There's recording royalties, of course, business interests. He had a tour production company, IP holding companies. These are things you wouldn't be surprised to hear that he would own. Image and likeness rights. Obviously, the NIL stuff that we've all come to learn a lot about because of sports now, name, image, and likeness, that the value at that point, the way it was assigned, was very low because of that was the market at the time. No one knew the potential value that it had. There was the example of Elvis where it turned out to have a ton of value, and there are a few other examples. But still, Michael Jackson, now we think of him as an icon, as this enduring emblem and this just, incredible performer, which he was. But at the time, some thought he was a bit of a has-been. And there was not, the predictions of a return of any sort in his career later. And I think that, it's fair to say that these valuations that were given for some of these assets were reasonable at the time. So personal property, and of course there's memorabilia, costumes, collectibles, valuables, and then cash accounts. We don't have the details on the real estate. It wasn't a huge portfolio, but he did invest in some commercial real estate, and Neverland he spent a ton of money on that of course he didn't get back. So now let me talk a little bit about the operation of the trust so we can move more into what we think is the real meaty part of our discussion today and what we think you'll find most useful and interesting. If you think of a trust, as I mentioned a while ago, let's not regard it as simply a lockbox, but it's instead this enterprise. And some assets are assembled in such a way to where they are relatively passive, meaning they can be through private equity funds, hedge funds. You can have investments in things that require less participation than simply actively running an ongoing business, for example. But some of you will have assets that more resemble an operating business in some form. And even if it's that you have a portfolio of real estate that requires active management. So these are things where you have to think of a trust as something that is ongoing and active and vibrant and requires decisions continually. Again, some more than others. You can choose to scale it back and put it in certain things that approach passivity, meaning a passive income. But I don't think with a trust you can become truly passive if it's managed correctly, because the goal is to manage it, to make it productive, to make it grow, to provide more benefits to the beneficiaries, which of course is the reason the trust exists. So, and then the job after death is, think of it this way. When you think of the duties of a trustee, remember, they're the CEOs. They're the people who are appointed to run this thing, this entity, we'll call it. And they have the responsibility for that entirely. It's success or failure. So we think about a trust. When you leave the world, you could assume that your trust will have a trustee who's paying taxes, right? Whatever taxes are due, paying debts, the debt's got to be paid, managing and growing assets I've just been describing, and then making the distributions according to the plan. Remember, the whole idea is not to allow the money to just sit and grow inside this container forever. Instead, the whole idea is there's going to pay out some process. It can be a variety of different ways, but there must be some means by which these assets are eventually distributed. And especially important is to have the income come out, or that can have some adverse consequences. So generally the income at least is paid out on an annual basis. What am I leaving out here?
Well, I definitely think, and when we think about what the trust actually is, and if we conceptualize it like it's living, it's not just a thing that is static. It is more of a living organism, and it has to be fed. There has to be someone actually working and making that particular trust profitable to make it so that when we get ready to make those distributions, that we're not depleting it. It's not just to make a transfer of whatever that asset is from one generation to the next, but something that is constantly feeding the next generation and the generation after that. So you have your corpus, your principal, but that corpus and that principal, even though, the person who may have settled it has passed on, that corpus is alive and it has to be fed. It has to be cultivated so that the distributions to the beneficiaries is something that can be sustainable over a long time. And the only way that you do that is by picking the right people to make sure that that happens. And so that's kind of when I think about how do I describe a trust, or how am I describing it to a client when I'm trying to have them consider whether or not this is the right vehicle for their assets or for the small business or for whatever it is that they're looking to operate through that trust. That this is the way that I'm describing it so that they know that this is not just somewhere where you're going to drop the assets off and let them sit there until it's time for them to be paid out. It's something that has to be cultivated in order to achieve the goal.
Yeah, well said. And before we talk more about the trustees, let's update our viewers in terms of this turnaround that we've kind of alluded to here a little bit from this estate that was worth we'll go with the negative $500 million. And it goes from that to, within a relatively short period of time, to generating $2 billion in revenue and net assets, depending on what you believe. We've had several guesses, but somewhere in the $600 million range net. But arguably, this $2 billion may reflect a better future value of this entity. We don't know that. But what a turnaround. And this turnaround happened pretty quickly. It wasn't as if this had, it occurred step by step over this period and in a straight appreciation line. Instead, it was, a lot of this was turned around in what, Mellany, 2, 3, 4 years?
Yeah, just a couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and this we're going to get to in our next show, but you can imagine the impact this has on the IRS on the issue about federal estate taxes. Mm-hmm. Is, you have a position where it can be argued, what taxes? We don't have any value here, or close to that argument. And IRS saying, whoa, look, we know a few years later you have $500 million in value at least, and when these arguments first started, they were into the hundreds of millions in actual net value. So the IRS is just, incredulous that the estate is taking the position that no, it's the date of death. So I don't want to get ahead on that topic, but I've kind of planted that seed. We'll spend some time talking about that later. So among the things, though, the transactions that explain this was it turned out that actually Michael Jackson's name, image, and likeness gained a lot of value after his death. And Mellany, your ideas may be better than mine. Was it just destined to happen?
Well, I believe that it's par for course. And if you really think about it, and I hate to say it this way, but sometimes in these situations, especially when you have an artist that has had the longevity of someone like Michael Jackson, that it's kind of like you said before, some people, and especially as the generations change, people in my generation may have still looked at Michael Jackson as he was still a really big deal. But with the younger generations, it's like, well, he's not the thing anymore. And so they may look at him as not necessarily being washed up, I think was the term that you used. And so when you look at that in terms of how you value what his name, image, and likeness was worth while he was alive, and then you begin to have newer generations look at, oh my God, who is this person? And the just incredible nature of his music, and they look at the historical context of him and his contribution to the arts, and it kind of changes things. And it's sad to say, but it's like you're worth more dead than you are alive. You couldn't sell the records alive if you're not, generating the same buzz after being in the business for so many years. People aren't coming, knocking down and filling up the stadiums like they used to. They're not buying the merchandising and that type of thing because there's a new thing. There are new artists. There's a Taylor Swift. There's a Beyonce. There's, all these other artists that are on the scene now. And that's where the focus is, right? That's where the kids and what they're looking at. And that's where the money is going. But unfortunately, when we had to experience his demise, it was almost as if his value quadrupled overnight. And I think that definitely contributes to why we see that at the date of death, I think it was that his name, image, and likeness was valued at $2,000. I'm like, that's the equivalent of saying that he could only sell about 100 T-shirts. And I just don't think that was accurate. And I'm sure the IRS was like, that's not accurate.
No, they didn't buy that story either. But
nobody's buying that story.
But the point is, it was clear that it was worth a lot less at that moment in time.
Right, right, at that moment in time.
So, Michael Jackson just has kept a cool factor, and he's really. He was considered cool in his day. Then he became a little uncool, as you suggested. But then it's like he became cool again.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that's hard to predict. But in this case, part of the increase in value that we talked about came from the NIL increase. But also there were some business decisions made by the trustees that significantly increased the value. Now, there was some appreciation in the Beatles and EMI, these publishing interests. They had bought the I guess you call it songbook or whatever. At one point, I know that Michael Jackson and Sony, and I'm going back in my mind, I haven't read this recently, but years ago, they each owned 50%. And so, and this is the Beatles song, but you can imagine the amount of money we're talking about in value.
Right.
And over time, he sold some of those shares, and now I think that they've completely sold his interest. But that value went up after his death. So even that's the reason a lot of the artists like Bob Dylan and others in the last 7 or 8 years have been selling this, is because maybe in the last 10 years, essentially, you've seen the value of these songbooks or these, it's not the right word I'm looking for.
Catalog?
Yeah, catalog is a better word. So that catalog is just, they're skyrocketing. So these artists from the 60s and 70s and 80s and beyond, I guess, it's irresistible for some of them to sell their catalogs. And they're getting, $400 and $500 and $600 million for these. And the Beatles, of course, would be the premium catalog sale. So that accounted for some of the appreciation. So it was a timely decision on the part of the trustees to sell when they sold. And I mentioned to you that Everland was sold. I'm sorry, Neverland. Oh, yeah, important point. $22 million, not 2.2, was what that Neverland sold for. So when we look at the other sales that took place, though, and some of those were actually the publishing rights of Michael Jackson himself, They retained some interest and sold some interest. That also was a timely decision when this peak interest in him, which occurred probably around 2015 to 2020, was a period of time when was probably maximum value. I don't know, perhaps it's increased more since then. But the bottom line is there was this huge increase in the value of the estate. So it goes literally from like this 500 negative to arguably 600 million net in a fairly short period of time. So this is we can't assure you that if you do a trust and that you put your assets in it and you choose a good trustee, that anything like this is going to happen in terms of rate of growth. This is extraordinary, but it does represent what can happen when assets are managed well that you put in your trust. And you want to be able to put all the assets of importance to you in your trust. You don't want to have to limit it to things that you think your uncle can manage well or somebody you know can manage well, because that means that you're going to be liquidating a lot of stuff. And it could be ongoing businesses, family businesses, a real estate portfolio, things that you would like to see stay in the family for a period of time. And those are perfect. That's perfect subject matter. That when you think about a trust, think this is the machinery that I need in order to be able to keep what is a family business continuing to operate for some period of time. And a trust, not unusually, will receive assets that require very active management. So this comes back to where we're transitioning to now. We want to talk more about the trustees of a trust. This is a hugely important decision if you're going to have a trust. And too often, I know you see this, Mellany, clients who will tend to just choose that uncle or cousin or brother who they think can do this. And for some assets, they probably can. But for those of you who have more complicated assets, and even, quite frankly, in those cases, it may not be suitable for those particular people, irrespective of the nature of the assets, for reasons relating to their ability to manage and keep it going and to deal with the interests of the beneficiaries and potential conflicts of interest, et cetera. So, and health and longevity. Those are factors in trustees, too. So why don't you launch us, Mellany? Tell us about what a trustee is and tie it into this scenario.
Okay, so when I am counseling with clients and I'm talking to them about the trustee, because of course from a legal perspective we can define the trustee as that person who is managing a trust, but that's basically using the word to define itself. So when I'm trying to get this across to a client, I'm trying to make them see that this is the person that you have a lot of trust in, but they also have to be competent in what it is that you want them to do. And you may feel like, well, of course, my brother Joe, he's done this, or my sister Jane, she's done that, and they're going to be the best person to manage this particular asset. When really what you should be looking for is the CEO. And I think that that's the best way to kind of describe it. This is going to be the ultimate CEO or CFO of what your business would have been had you lived long enough to take care of it yourself. So once the trust is in the hands of that trustee, this is the person that is running the show. This is the person that's going to make all the critical decisions in terms of how this asset is going to grow. Now, of course, in the trust terms, there are certain things that your attorney is going to help you craft to make sure that certain goals are accomplished, certain rules are followed. That part, the legalese, is the attorneys will take care of that part. But when it comes to the ultimate goal of the trust, who is it that you want to be behind the wheel in terms of making the decisions? And so that's your CEO. And when you pick the wrong person, they can make decisions that are not necessarily the best for your ultimate goal. So if growth is your ultimate goal and you're looking to, yes, transfer and push the income out in distributions, that's great. But growth is going to be what makes that distribution worthwhile. So in that type of situation, you want to make sure that you have someone who is in control, that is competent to do that job. And sometimes that's just not the family member. Sometimes that has to be another professional that you bring in to help you manage the complications of that trust.
Yeah, and also the person that might come to mind in the family, it's not uncommon that, let's assume our client is an older person, so they're probably choosing one of their kids. Well, I mean, that may work incidentally, so I don't want people to think I'm completely saying that's a bad idea, but they need to think about the fact that there could be conflicts of interest because it puts them in the position of they're a beneficiary and they're also a trustee. And so it's setting them up to be the recipient of accusations from.
Right. There's going to definitely be a concern for self-dealing. So if I'm the person who is running the trust and I'm the one who is also a beneficiary of the trust, am I doing things that's for the benefit of all of the beneficiaries or things that are just in my own interest? And so you just have to be careful of that type of thing.
Yeah, and that is so notoriously a problem where accusations are made against trustees, even trustees where they're not a beneficiary, but they're still accused, as we'll talk about in this case, and I think we'll do it in this show. We'll see. But how this is really one of the scenarios in Michael Jackson's estate where we can talk about things that might have been done better, but nonetheless, it's not at all uncommon, and it may in fact be unavoidable that you're going to have some beneficiaries who are not happy with decisions that a trustee's making. And these can be expenses that they're paid or expenses that they're incurring. It can be their refusal to distribute assets in the way that the beneficiaries may want. Those are all things that's not uncommon for a trustee to find themselves in that position. So when you're choosing somebody, you need to think about, is this somebody that can hold up to that sort of stress and potential conflict, or are they just going to throw up their hands and walk out the door? And that it's not uncommon for that to happen, and the court ends up having to appoint a trustee if you've not named your own successor. But if you're getting your trust prepared by a competent lawyer who practices in that field, then yeah, they'll assure that you've named successor trustees. So anything else we say before we talk about this specific selections, or should we just talk about the selections first?
Oh, I think we can just get into the selections, because I think that anything else that I could probably add, or what I want to say right now, I can add when we start talking about how we make that selection. Yeah,
because we'll give you, our viewers, some context here. Michael Jackson chose not a family member, which is very unusual. Often a family member will at least be one of the trustees. And again, despite all the precautions that we would mention regarding that, we're not discouraging it. We're just saying that you need to take precautions. Still, it's commonly done, and it's not always a problem. But in this case, Michael Jackson had the wisdom to choose two professionals in this role, no family members. And the names, one is John Branca. He's an attorney. He had been very active in Michael Jackson's career. As a matter of fact, he had been somebody that Michael Jackson looked to credit with some of the most spectacular portions of his career. The Thriller phase, when that video came out and all the buzz around that, including the tour, et cetera. I don't know the details of John Branca's involvement in that, but apparently he was a decision maker in as to going down those roads and making those investments and doing the things that led to among the most profitable periods, probably was the most profitable period of Michael Jackson's career. So Michael Jackson came to trust him, and yet it's not as if this relationship is entirely free of conflict. He was fired at least twice by Michael Jackson and rehired. And in fact, the last time he was rehired was shortly before Michael Jackson's death. But John Branca he is a lawyer, but he's an expert in the entertainment industry. He understands much of it, including the investment side as well as the legal side and operations. So it's really unusual to find somebody with that sort of experience and a resume that was a proven resume. So we should be able to, all of us think, yeah, Michael Jackson, I think, made a good choice there. And then John McClain. John McClain is an executive from the recording industry. He too is considered an insider within the industry. He knows who to talk to get things done. He's a go-to guy for artists, for investors, for studio execs and other studios in LA and beyond. So John McClain also was a known quantity that Michael Jackson had dealt with also for many years, decades. So you have two men that Michael Jackson felt he could trust and he knew had the expertise. So you can see here that he seems to be setting this up for the way he wants his estate to be operated after his death. Why don't you take it from there, Mellany, in terms of what you read was the intention? We don't have all the details, do we, of the trust itself? We have some.
Well, I think that in this situation, a part of the choice, or in his mind, or at least of what I think in his mindset, is the purpose for choosing these persons rather than family members, is that you look at what it is that he's trying to accomplish and who actually has the skill, the knowledge, and the information to accomplish that. Not only do you have two, people that he's worked with, that he's trusted, he has he had a lot of an opportunity to kind of develop relationships with these people. And in their advisory capacities, I'm sure that they spoke to him about how things should be managed. And you think about how the business was run while he was here and who helped him do that. And with wise counsel, I'm assuming that, that with Branca and the other professionals that were in his circle at that time, they're advising him on who is going to be the best person to help you move this forward or to accomplish the goals that you have, or actually, and I think even more than that, painting clearly what his goals should be, because I'm sure he has some ideas. And if you think about how a family wants to take care of family, they want to take care of their children, they want to take care of their parents, but they may not know the best route to do that. So I think that in choosing Branca and McClain, kind of the things that were going through his mind are, how am I going to accomplish this goal to take care of my family the way I want to, and who's going to be the most trusted source to get that done. Because like you were saying before, I would never discourage a family member, elder parent, from choosing their children as their trustee. However, when you're making that choice, you're doing so with whoever. If you have a lawyer, your daughter is a lawyer, or your daughter is a CPA, or your daughter is a small business owner, these are people who are going to have a different level of understanding in terms of what to do with that trust. So I think that there was some insight for Michael Jackson in terms of these folks when he decided to choose them, that this is what they're capable of doing, and this is what's going to help, kind of move this process along the way that I want to see it happen. If I were here to do it myself, I think that they're going to carry out my wishes the way that I would do it myself.
Yeah, and what's also interesting and consistent with that is Michael Jackson must have had in mind the continuing operation of these businesses. It would seem that if he wanted them to be simply liquidated in whole, and which technically could have been done. I mean, everything could have been sold in, say, 60 months or less, and then it could have just been money in a bank account, and the trust still could have gone on. Because selling the assets, for our viewers, whenever you sell the businesses or you sell the real estate, that doesn't interfere with the right for the trust to continue operating. You just keep the funds in the trust, and now there's not active management in the same sense of the word as there is when you had the businesses. However, Michael Jackson, choosing these two people, it's not like choosing simply professionals, because one option that we mentioned to our clients is you can choose like the trust department of any major banking firm, any trust company that simply does trust. There's a variety of field brokerage firms. There are a variety of financial institutions that offer professionals who manage trusts. And these trust departments have professionals They have accountants, they have lawyers. They charge a fee for this, but it is a way to know you have professional management and you have continuity. In other words, these don't die like individuals, or they don't quit, or they don't become incompetent, and those things that individual human beings all do. But Michael Jackson wanted more than that. That would have been what I might have predicted if I were predicting what did he do. I'd say, well, he probably would have chosen some very reputable trust department in a major financial institution. But no, he wanted two people in the industry who could actually continue operating these businesses that he had going at the time. And there were several, the company relating to production of events. There was continuing to actively market his name, image, likeness. There was this portfolio of catalogs that he had in various artists. We just mentioned a couple, but there's Aretha Franklin and others. So he invested in these portfolios. So these are not passive jobs. And so Michael Jackson seemed to have made a clear statement, and I wonder if he worded it even that way in his trust, that he wanted these to continue, as you point out, Mellany, you've emphasized growth, that he wanted growth. And there's no better way to get growth than to be able to do it in that industry by people who know how to do it. That's where you see 50%, 100%, 200% growth. That's one of those industries where that can happen if you have the right management.
Right. I think that we just can't discount, just because he was a creative, that he did not have the business mind or the business sense to understand what he needed to put in place to continue his vision. And I don't want to say that he was predicting into his future, that what would happen after his death, but I don't think that he was a legend in his own mind. I think that he was aware, very aware of the value, even though there may have been different things that happened, where it may not have appeared that the value of his name, image, and likeness, or any of the investment projects, were necessarily as high as they once were in the early Michael Jackson years. But I believe somewhere inside his mind, there was a business sense that he understood what he needed in order to make sure that he had the ability, that these projects, and maybe he thought Neverland Ranch was going to be something different. Maybe he thought that some of these other projects were going to produce a different way. But I believe that he had to know from a business standpoint that, one, I needed somebody that I trust. So I think that the thing that you said that's very important is not just job fillers. These are just not people with the credentials who sat in these spaces. These are people that he trusted. So they're people that he trusted, but that they also were competent. And I think that that's a very important combination. And what we seek to do, I hope, with our clients is help them find the same type of competent trustee. And I guess that's where the name is derived from, the person that you're going to trust to manage this type of situation in your own real life. Yeah, it is. It's an important, we're dwelling on this, viewers, because it's just very important that you make the right decision. And granted, it's more important for some of your assets, for the type of assets that some of you have, than it is for the type of assets that others of you have. But as to all of you, the trustee is the person who's responsible for helping those assets grow. And I'm going to jump to the conclusion that many of you will want a trust that will endure for a long period of time so they can fully benefit your loved ones, and that during that period of time, you'd like to see the assets really grow, of course, without undue risk. So I think Michael Jackson was willing to assume some risk here. That was his nature, I think. I agree. Yeah. So he wasn't somebody who was going to want to go to immediately to blue chip stocks, right. As we've just said. I think that his goal was substantial growth. And he felt that these guys who had done this for him during his life had helped him do that they can continue doing that. So that kind of sets up the role of the trustee and what potential conflicts can occur. So I wonder if we should conclude this episode at this point. I think this is a good stopping point, don't you, Mellany, before we go in and talk about some conflicts that can develop
between the trustee and the beneficiary?
Absolutely, because I think we could probably spend an entire episode talking about the potential types of conflicts and what to do in those situations.
Yeah, so we're going to do it that way. We've kind of set this up for you, and in this next episode, what we're going to talk about is, how do you deal with this potential conflict? It's a natural thing to occur. This is a person in charge of assets that are to go to people who can't have them until the trustee gives it to them. So you put a trustee on the opposite side of a table, so to speak, from the beneficiaries, and it really sets the stage for a lot of conflict, especially when the estate is a long time coming to an end, and there's lots of expenses and lots of fees and lots of skepticism from beneficiaries about, are the trustees thinking more about themselves? So this is kind of setting the stage for you for our next show. And it's very interesting. And again, very useful information for you to think about on your much smaller scale. But these concepts are the same. They're not unique to somebody like Michael Jackson's heirs and his trustees. It's not unique to them at all. These same concepts drive virtually all conflicts in estate planning and in probate. So with this, Mellany, we'll wrap up, but you and I will do this again on the next episode. So until then, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Take care.
We hope you enjoyed Life's Third Act, sponsored by Cordell Cordell, your advisors for estate planning and beyond. Subscribe and join us weekly for thought-provoking discussion and topics exclusively focused on estate planning and your financial future. Discover more at CordellCordell.com. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.